Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight at IPCNY for a conversation with Nina Jordan, Aric Russom, and Nicholas Ruth. I'm Jenn Bratovich. I'm IPCNY's Exhibitions and Curatorial Manager. These artists each have work on view in IPCNY's Summer 2021 New Prints exhibition, which is called Lonely Hearts. New Prints exhibitions are selected through an open call and are juried by folks out in the print field. Our current show was selected by the artist Christian Baumgartner. Lonely Hearts is currently on view at our Chelsea exhibition space right now, and we are back to our pre-pandemic hours, so Tuesday through Saturday, 11 to 6 p.m. And if you're not in town or you want to explore the show virtually, you can do that through a 3D scan of the gallery, which is hosted through our website. So you can walk around the space, you can move up to the works, you can click on the little dots to see label text, and you can experience the show as if you were there almost. You can also explore the show through our website, where you can see high-res images of all the works, and you can read artist statements from all of the artists included in the exhibition. So 2 notes about accessibility for tonight's program. First, we have live captioning in English, and you can find the captions by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen if you are on desktop, or you can go into the settings menu on mobile. Second, we will try to be verbally descriptive about the works we discuss on screen tonight, which helps all of us who are at home experiencing art through our screens. And tonight's program will also be recorded and available on our YouTube channel in about a week or so, so watch for that. So now I'll invite our artists to please join me on screen. And everyone at home, please welcome Nina, Aric, and Nick. Everyone, maybe please just unmute and say hello so we know your voices.
Hello.
Hi there. Hello.
Hello, hello.
Hi, everybody. We are happy to have you all with us tonight and to think about your work. The format is a little bit different from previous New Prints Artist Talks. So tonight we're trying out a little bit more of a conversational format. I'm going to guide us through some questions and keep us on track, but artists, please feel free to interject, to ask each other questions, respond to each other's work and ideas throughout the program. For folks at home, please send questions using the Q&A function, and I will take questions at the end of the night, or if there's like a ton of questions, I may take them throughout the program as well. Please don't hold back. There's also a public chat that will be open throughout the program. Please feel free to contribute any conversation there, comments, thoughts that aren't direct questions that you'd like the artist to answer. And then finally, there is a survey that's super short at the very end. We really appreciate if you could just answer a few questions. It helps us produce better programs for you. So to get started, we are under the theme, tonight we are here under the theme of architecture and space and the built environment. And as we look at the selection that our juror Christian Baumgartner put together for this show, we see different clusters and themes and constellations kind of emerge from that show. And this is one of those constellations that was actually pretty prominent among the artists who are gathered here tonight, but also among many artists in the show. And so in the context of the last year and the framework that Christian lent us, which is thinking about isolation, distance, kind of formal emptiness, contemplation, I find conversations about how we're relating to our built environment to be so super pressing. And so we're here tonight to see some of the points of intersection and divergence among the works and the ideas that they deal with that Nina and Aric and Nick are working with. So to start, we're going to show the works that are in the exhibition at IPCNY. And I'd love to just set up a kind of broad couple of questions and hear from each artist in thinking about their work in the show. It's maybe a two-pronged question. The first is one that I'm always interested in when artists make work about place, which is, where did you grow up in terms of a landscape and a built environment? What was that visual environment and encounter for you as a kid growing up? And then the second question is, what do you see in this idea of architecture or built environment that motivates you, and how is that revealed or approached in your work in a broad way? So I think maybe we'll start with Nina and kick things off there, and then we'll go through, I think it's set up alphabetically. We'll see. Lots of surprises in store. Nina, take it away.
Okay, so I'll try to give a little description of this. This is a print, a woodblock, multicolored, sort of muted colors print of two houses, between two houses and the sidewalk, and with reflections in the window. And I grew up in New York City, and in an apartment in New York City, different apartments in New York City. And what was your second part of the question? It was about how I felt about the built.
Yeah, just how do you approach this issue of architecture, built environment in your work? How do you approach it?
How do I approach it? I'll tell you what this is about. These are real estate listings, and from my personal background, my mom always wanted a house, and she grew up without a house, and with a lot of housing and food insecurity, and she just always wanted a house. And when my dad moved to California when I was 8, that was what she wanted, and we just looked for houses all the time. Of course, at that point, she couldn't afford it, but there was always that sense of wanting to provide that stability for me. So that's where I come at houses and homes. If that's an answer to your question.
Absolutely. Thanks, Nina.
Sure.
Aric, I think, is next.
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
Yeah. So this is. I'll do a quick description. A image of a skyscraper type building with blues and grays and sort of an upwards perspective. And I was born in Western Mass and kind of amongst a lot of mill towns, and grew up. My parents had a loft in a mill in Leeds, a silk mill. And so I was there for the first couple years. I don't remember that, but I certainly remember the stories from it and images, and it just being this wonderful place. So being in and around mills, living now in East Hampton, where there are 6 partially defunct mills, partially rehabbed spaces, this was architecture that became interesting to me. This print is a little bit different from some of the buildings that I've been working with over the last couple of years. And it could be a new direction, but that's where I'm coming from.
Great. Thanks, Aric. And Nick, welcome.
Yeah, well, thank you, and hello to everybody. By way of describing the print that's in the show, this is one of a series of intaglio prints that depict real cell towers that don't look like that in their situation, in their real life. A big cell tower here, this one, Farmington Town Hall, it's really there, and I went and looked at it carefully and studied it in order to be able to try to present it, but then took it out of context and put it into a different one, which is just a barren, kind of foreboding landscape with a blank sky, an empty sky, and a sparsely populated ground plane. And I grew up in Philadelphia, actually, within the city limits, but out in the northwestern section of the city, a neighborhood called Germantown. And for me, the built environment is something that just sort of strikes me visually as I move through it on a day-to-day basis, whether that's on foot or a bike or commonly in a car as I commute quite a ways to work. And so, for instance, this body of work comes out of speeding along the highway and spacing out and thinking about whatever, and just being sort of surprised and curious and struck by these weird and interesting things, and then wanting to try to do something with that.
Fantastic. Thank you. So the thing that really anchored this talk for me, or my thinking about how I wanted to kind of approach this talk, was Nina's works, and how these works like this can really reflect not only our anxieties, but also our longing, or maybe not only our longing, but also our anxiety for things in our contemporary lives, and the way that buildings and built environment reflect that. And so, Nina, I'm showing here some of your Dream Home series, which has this text running along the bottom and the top, respectively, on the two images that say "Affordable Dream Home for All." I wondered if you could, these works really bring that home for me, and to use a pun, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you got started making these in the context of kind of economic crisis and the mortgage crisis in the mid 2000s, I guess, or late aughts, and then how you think about this now as we kind of face the economic insecurity and the housing situation in kind of our immediate post-COVID landscape.
Well, as you see, these were done in last year and during COVID. And they were actually done during all the Black Lives Matter protests. And what they really are is about the American dream, which is why I call them dream homes. And the one on the left is in Louisville. No, the one on the left is in what town is it? Brunswick, Georgia. And the one on the right is in Louisville, Kentucky. And they're both homages to Ahmaud Arbery was from Brunswick, Georgia, and Breonna Taylor from Louisville, Kentucky. So I took those two houses because I felt the need to make artwork in my heart that responded to what was going on, and talk about equity and the American dream. So these were really responses to that, because as we know, there's not a lot of equity in housing, and that's what I was thinking about when I was doing those too, and accessibility to the so-called American dream.
Yeah, that's I actually didn't know that before you just shared that bit, Nina. So that's really great to hear, and definitely, Emma, if you show the next slide, some of your earlier houses that were made earlier in the decade are those that, correct me if I'm wrong, directly respond to the housing crisis and
yes. These I always had the thing for looking at real estate because I started as a kid just with this dream of being able to buy my mom a house, because this was something she wanted to own property. I was like, so many people must relate to this idea of like someday being rich and being able to buy your mother a home, right? And she ended up buying her own home finally. So it's not like everything's good. But so I had this thing about, I just love looking at real estate listings and thinking, so after the mortgage crisis, I was just doing my regular thing, and everywhere you look, there would just pop up these homes for under 50,000, homes for foreclosure sales, bank-owned properties for nothing, and it would just pop up, these horrible things. And you go on and you'd see these whole places that were just like swaths of area that were just all foreclosed properties. And I really responded to something that Nick said in his video about the radio towers being portraits. And so when I looked at these houses, I tried to make them portraits of the houses, and I tried to have them express the you know, the loss or the longing or just the feeling of home. And the numbers are about, you know, obviously about the, you know, these houses are people's shelter, but it's this whole thing, this trading of the mortgages and the subprime mortgages and the predatory lending, and it was, you know, all about commodity and just this horrible sad contrast between people's lives and other people making money. And anyway, so I tried to convey that in these portraits of houses. I think I said in my statement something about, it's about who lives here, who wants to live here, and what does that say? And that's kind of what I was trying to convey.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned this, that you picked up on this Nick's comment about portraits, because this was a question I really wanted to ask as well. When I was putting this together and seeing your work side by side in the slideshow, and I wondered if you thought of them as portraits or had ever thought of them as portraits. And then that led me to the question of, like, what is portraiture as a mode of looking at something or of constructing an image of something? And Nick and Nina, I don't know if you have thoughts about that, about what that means to make something a portrait, as opposed to maybe just capture it another way.
Well, portrait is, you know, you try to convey the, you know, the soul of the thing, right? You try to convey the emotion of the thing. You try to tell something, you know, and then if you, you know what I'm saying, right? Nick, please take over.
Yeah, well, no, and I agree with that, of course, and certainly see that and feel that in your work, which is so evocative and you know, tender in that way. But for me, the concept of portraiture is as much about, you know, what is concealed as is revealed. And so we have these things in the landscape, for instance, with cell towers, you know, presenting themselves as a fact, just an assumption, and we just get used to them so fast. But what are they, and what do they actually do? You know, so in my mind, and maybe this relates immediately right back to your work. These are the portraits of the bank presidents rather than portraits of the dispossessed families. And so to me, there's a quality in which portraits idealize their subjects in many cases, at least that kind of official portrait that I'm thinking of. It's a public facing representation, and it obscures much of what's going on beneath the surface. So that's how it frames up for me in this case. I'm not really imagining, well, I do sometimes actually imagine all of the, you know, bajillions of messages that are flying through these things all the time. But I'm simultaneously aware that they're part of a surveillance state, and that, you know, and they don't necessarily make us better at communicating.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about that image making. And I wonder, maybe if we just actually let's don't want to lose my thread on Nina's work too much. So let me go back to Nina's previous slide and just ask her like a couple of quick questions I have about how she, this kind of feels like an archival project in some way. So I'm a little bit curious about, can you take me inside your process of gathering these listings? How do you choose which ones are going to become prints? Like, take me a little bit inside your curation of listings and your collecting of listings.
Well, you should see the folder that I have on my desktop of all these listings, and they're all like different cities, you know, small cities, and or Brooklyn. I have some in Brooklyn and Queens, but it's so much fun because there's some really interesting visuals of these things, and they have so much feeling, and they're so interesting. And when you go into the listing and look in, you can really find out so much about, well, you can find out so much about what the city is. And I always say, like, if you want to find out about what this small city is like, you just go in and look at the real estate listings, and you can find out so much. You can find out, you know, so much about the demographic. You can find out so much about just, I don't know, about the climate. I mean, it's everything's in there. But I love searching through them, and if you ever try it, you will see that it's a very fun and easy pastime to find interesting real estate listings, and you'll start collecting them. And I'm pretty sure, like, I can't imagine anybody, if you're just looking at them as visual things and you really like collecting visual things, I can't imagine anybody not finding them fascinating, because they really are. I just go on Realtor and Trulia and all those ones to just look. And
yeah, they're like a really interesting little slice of of Americana in a weird way, especially with these houses being these like historical, like these older homes that you're dealing with here. Makes me
and sometimes they're not old. I've done trailers, and I you know, basically I usually find a city that I'm interested in, a small city. Like when Pete Buttigieg became, you know, when I was introduced to him, and I started seeing him, what's South Bend, Indiana? Well, you know, what's that? I've, you know, I mean, I've heard it, but I don't know what it's like. So I go on and look at the real estate listings, and I pick up this one and that one, but it usually, that's the kind of thing. What's this town like? You know, what are the outskirts of Atlanta? I mean, everybody knows what was happening in Detroit, and what happened in Detroit. But what does this really look like? What does it mean to live in this place? And then that's when I start bouncing around the listings, you know, and trying to really get one that feels like, I don't know, they're fun.
yeah.
It's a lot of good material.
They hold a lot. Yeah, they hold a lot. Emma, if you go to the next slide, and I want to ask Nick, and then maybe actually, so here we're seeing two other of the recent intaglio towers of Nick's. But if we go to even the next slide, we see a little bit of an earlier work that uses the same like cell tower motif, but it looks quite different than the work that's at IPCNY. And so, Nick, I wanted to ask you, can you walk us through a little bit like how you, and maybe in whichever order it makes sense to you, what the place of color is in your practice and in your process, and then how you also ended up moving toward this, the working in intaglio more recently, maybe it looks like more recently, is this, what has kind of motivated this shift? What does that lack of color kind of mean for you? And how is the exploration of the towers like changing based on the material investigations that you're using?
Yeah. Well, thanks for that. And of course, it's a complicated question, right? Because, you know, at least for me, the way my work unfolds is across a number of lines of inquiry, sort of more or less at the same time, constrained by access and opportunity and time and resources. And so I guess another way of putting it would be to say that I don't imagine myself to be, you know, someone who is an etcher or a lithographer. It's more the case that certain particular media strike me as appropriate for what it is I'm trying to get at. And that's really my entrance into printmaking overall. I mean, I studied a little bit in college and fell in love with intaglio for its rich material and visual qualities. I mean, you know, the black you can get out of an aquatint or a mezzotint is just something I'll always respond to. But I had been painting mostly for a long time, and then I was just getting really frustrated with not being able to use big open areas of luminous color. And I saw a printmaker that so many of us might know, Karen Kunk, give a demonstration of her reduction woodcut process. and was just blown away by the luminosity of what she was able to produce, all while still having a quality of invention and a certain organic feel to the work. So I really responded to that, and I began to explore her method a little bit, quite a bit more clunkily than she does, but it still allowed me to get at what I wanted to get at, which was a certain intensity of feeling that color can produce. And in particular, it struck me that I could maybe use color as both a site of beauty on the one hand, but also something a little bit destabilizing, something that would introduce a quality of surrealism into the imagery that I was working with. So rather than being more documentary about it, I wanted to call attention to these things that we take for granted by making the depiction of them strange, by making the clouds in the sky and the ground that we would all immediately recognize and name be odd enough that we had to stop and really look at it. So color in particular had that dual function for me, an access to just sort of a potency of intense feeling on the one hand, and then also a way to get at a certain kind of anxiety and wrongness, in just the right way, I guess. And so the intaglio work, I just want to say quickly, is something that I've been thinking about for a long, long time. I've been wanting to make those prints for years. And that was a matter of time and resources and opportunity. And I met the folks at Mirabeau Press in Buffalo and had a conversation with them about helping me to do that work. And they were on board with working with me on this, and we had an amazing collaborative experience. And for anybody that has an opportunity to do something like that, I couldn't recommend it more. Working with Mijin and Bob and Rachel was phenomenal. Mijin's on the call tonight, so she's just put their site into the chat. So please check them out. They are truly amazing. But that's, in my mind, not really a turn towards something, but rather an opportunity to get at something.
Yeah, it's amazing to me how much the treatment of these changes through that different approach, and the desolation just feels like so dramatic in these intaglio works to me. Like, and we were just talking before we started the broadcast. I'm from California. I'm from out west, and I've been out here for a few weeks, and I've just been looking at like flat openness a lot while driving and thinking about these structures on the side of the road, and they just have that eeriness to them that's so palpable, that you feel when you're driving and you're encountering these, and they're a little spooky, right? I think they're a little spooky. These are really captured by that. The next ones I want to ask about, Emma, if we go forward just a couple, are the way that you have also explored signage that one would see from the road. And can you just tell us a little bit about these and what has captured, what inspires you to turn, what compels you to turn the object around, right? We've seen blank billboards, we've seen blank signs, and thinking of like Ed Ruscha and others who have painted or printed, things like that. But why turn the object around as you often do? And what about this accumulation of signs happens in these prints that's interesting for you?
A lot of it, again, starts with just being struck by seeing something. And perhaps that's a kind of wonderingness in moving through space. So constantly moving through space in such a transactional way. I got to get from here to over there, and I'm kind of got to hurry up and all this kind of stuff. But at the same time, being somebody who's really visual and just noticing weird shapes and things that are striking. And so I'm always struck by, billboards, the things that hold them up, the backs of them, all the, grid work and structures that put that all together. And so they're just interesting, cool, weird shapes, first. Yeah. But then I start thinking about that, and I start thinking, well, what are these things for anyway? And then I realize, oh yeah, they're a site of communication, you know, just like the cell towers are a site of communication. But of course, in the case of billboards, they're a site of, you know, persuasion as well. They have a function in our society, and we're happy to stick them out in the middle of a field so that we can sell you something and try to tell you, you know, who you should be and what you should want and how you should think. So I'm sort of struck by the beauty of them and the weirdness of them, but also the kind of troubling quality of how they serve as a mode or a modality of communication. And that just gets me thinking about just communication in general. And so, you know, as a true child of the 70s, you know, existentialism is my brand of philosophy. And so I end up thinking about this as just how difficult it is to communicate, and that signs end up being a perfect stand-in for that, because there's this semiotic quality to depicting the structure of the sign rather than the actual explicit message on the sign. And I'm very, very interested in that.
Oh, they're beautiful works, and the way that you capture the blankness of the surfaces, I found so compelling. You know, Nick shared with us a few videos that kind of show his process a little bit. Talked about this layering of all these transparent colors and the building up that surface. And this was so compelling to me, Emma, if you look at the next slide, when I was putting this together, thinking about how Aric also deals with building up these surfaces. And so by way of transitioning here, I'm showing two images of Aric's that are a little bit older, or actually one's from maybe just slightly older. Aric, I'll let you set the context for that. But these works that the way you take such a different approach here to the building up of those surfaces and the colors and the handling of your ink than the one we have on view at IPCNY. And so I would love to invite you to just tell us a little bit about these, describe these windows to us, tell us a little bit about your process and how you're building this up, and why the handling the way that you do in dealing with these surfaces.
Sure. Yeah, these prints are, you know, a year or two old, couple of years. They relate to a series of paintings that I made many years back that had to do with some local mills that were in a defunct state or in the process of being rehabilitated. And I remember standing in front of one of these banks of windows and being struck by this kind of complex visual experience where I could see, you know, deep into these recessed spaces and some mysterious machinery. And I was also all of a sudden confronted by opaque panes and reflected light. And then within the reflections of the glass, I could see this space hundreds of feet back. And so I was fascinated by this layering of space. So I made a series of paintings. I think the following slide actually is one of those. And I went through a period where my painting slowed down. I was doing other things, and I was getting frustrated by not having, with my teaching schedule, the same chunks of time to spend, you know, hours at a time. And I was looking for a new practice. And I think I was actually teaching relief at the time. And I started working that way, and it was easier to start and stop. And this is maybe a little bit more than you asked, but that's how I got back into printmaking. And I revisited some of these buildings and wanted to see, you know, what was happening years later. And the switch from painting to printmaking, I think Nick might have touched on this. The change in medium, print is naturally flatter, but I was looking for a medium that shared some of the qualities in painting that I really loved, and that was, you know, big open pieces of color, and, you know, still a way to depict space, very interested in layering and seeing what layers of translucent inks going down will do, even though it's a completely different process. So working with relief fit into my physical schedule better, and it also steered the direction of what I was looking at in the buildings. I began looking at flatter areas. I began looking more at the shapes and the colors within the panes, and it became a little more playful. And so that's how I came across this process. I think I forget the fellow who, when I first discovered the reductive process, someone said that Picasso kind of practiced the reduction method, but maybe was maybe misgiving credit for it. But as opposed to multi-blocks, it's and Nina can talk about this too. You work from one block and you just gradually reduce that as you add layer of ink, and you kind of work in reverse. So you print a layer, you carve that away, and you go back and you print another layer. And these are stacks of 10, 15, and 20 layers. So being someone that was new to this, I had asked a printmaker, how do you handle registration? And they were like, oh, registration, that's not important. Well, I discovered it actually is fairly important. And so many things that can affect that, in terms of moisture, the time, how many times you run a piece of linoleum through the press and it stretches. If you're using Turnsburton tabs, they can get rounder. And so all sorts of interesting tips along the way to figure out how to get 15 layers down where they need to be, and the excitement of putting a new layer on, and seeing what happens with that. So
I saw Nina excitedly put her glasses on and lean forward when this image came up, which shows this work window 1 on the left, and then shows 4 stages of the work being made, and describes what Aric is telling us here about how the image is sort of built up in this reverse way, through the reduction of the matrix. And so Nina, who's also working in reduction woodcut, like, do you have a reaction there? The excitement that I saw you express looked.
I was going to ask him how many passes he had with the thing, but you said 15. You did, I think, 15 layers on these things. That's amazing.
Some of them, yeah. Some, this is 10, I think. But sometimes they go through the press more than that if the color didn't go down the way I wanted it to. I'm still on a curve learning this, and so sometimes I'll put a color down and it's the wrong one, and I'll go back, I'll blot it and put a new color down. So they can, sometimes they run through the press 25, 30 times.
Amazing. Wow.
And often, and I'm trying to be better about creating more proofs along, at the beginning. The nature of reduction is you have to start with as many prints as you're going to make, because the block's gone at the end. So I'm getting better about adding more artist proofs at the beginning so that I can play with things, because I find I'm having a hard time keeping a consistent run throughout, because I want to tinker and I want to see, well, what happens if I go in this direction? And so sometimes I end up with a varied edition. This is a woodcut I did, and I was just looking at texture before I had done a version of this in color, and wanted to see how it played out with line. Was also interested in taking the windows out of context from the building, and to see how that felt and how they kind of came across as icon, I guess.
Yeah, I was really excited that you included this one, because it was such a different image in the selection you sent. And what we see here are these 4 windows, and in woodcut, and they are so abstracted. and so flattened here in a way that, you know, even the previous works we don't quite see, and where the line work, it becomes almost kind of this formal exercise that really explores the space and the qualities of the medium, right? Like the wood itself, in a really interesting way. Was this kind of just like a little, like, was this an experiment, or do you work in woodcut, or?
I haven't worked a lot in woodcut. I sometimes get frustrated by it. I love the sort of unpredictability at times, and simultaneously frustrated where you have to sort of change. But this was, you know, working with this subject, and the pains are so unique, and they're all, you know, it doesn't matter. You can go in a direction, you can change it, and you know, you have to sort of be flexible with the medium. And yeah, I was working out ideas. This was the first time that I'd looked at the windows, you know, individually from the building, and wanted to see, you know, just the character of them and kind of highlight that, without the, you know, the presence of the grid of the structure itself. So.
Yeah, you know, and I wonder, I want to hold for a second on this thought about the structure that the windows belong to, right? The buildings themselves that you're looking at, and in some way maybe creating some kind of a portrait of, in maybe if we're talking about portraits tonight. But I'm curious, like, the types of buildings that attract you, the types of building, you know, these are not just any windows, these are windows from these kind of industrial buildings. You mentioned growing up, you know, around these mills. And I wonder, like, what is it that has captured you about those spaces specifically? Like, why these windows?
Well, this is, you know, I live in a kind of a small, local community, and you know, some of these buildings are real relics, and you know, there's a history of people working in, you know, in these spaces. And at the time, I started looking at these. There was one mill in our town that had been rehabbed, the former Stanley Home Products building, and I had a studio space there, and it had, you know, this mess of windows. You know, three of them were open, and pigeons were nesting in there, and the sun would come in and it would soak, oil would like pool up on the surface, and my dog would, you know, look around for a dry spot to lay down. And then they came through and they redid all the floors, and the rents doubled, and a lot of artists ended up moving out. And over the next few years, more and more of these buildings in town have been, you know, rehabilitated. The town working with, you know, buyers and constructors to, you know, add some cases affordable housing, which is wonderful. And you know, in other cases, the most recent building, complex on Ferry Street, it looks like there are going to be some luxury condos going in. And so, you know, there's certainly a narrative of how these buildings are being repurposed. You know, what the history of who was in there, and what kind of work, what kind of industry was taking place, and then what goes forward. And so that's certainly something that I'm interested in.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I grew up on the West Coast, but I went to college in Rochester, New York, which I believe is where
Mhm.
is these days. And so I remember moving out there and being kind of struck by seeing, you know, like old Kodak manufacturing, and just like, it was kind of a type of building I'd never seen. I was used to seeing, you know, growing up in the sort of flat agricultural space of California, seeing, you know, grain silos and cell towers, and things like
Right.
that. But these buildings really captured me from an outsider perspective when I showed up, and I just thought about, like, wow, things are so old, right? And to me, that concept of like old being, you know, the 1800s, like manufacturing going back to the before the 20th century, I thought was like the oldest thing at the time. My world was so small. And so I share your interest in these spaces as ones that tell us something about how about how culture and society changes over time, and the way that those spaces have become kind of dispossessed, and the way that power has shifted culturally kind of away from those cities, but is maybe coming back in certain ways, and how we maybe repurpose those buildings and use them toward a future where like space can be used again, right? In productive and cooperative, often cooperative ways. Those are hopefully things that are on the horizon for some of these kind of formerly industrial sites across the US.
Yeah, no, someone chimed in about, New York. Certainly this is something that is going on all across, the country, where, these buildings have been vacant, industries moved on, and, it's a lot of money to restore one of these buildings. I remember hearing just the amount of, just to redo the electrical is $500,000. So it takes an effort, it takes an investor that is willing to put it forth, and a government that is really willing to work to make sure that the outcome benefits the community. And I think that's they've done a really nice job overall in our town with that. But it doesn't always go that way. So.
I also like the inclusion of woodcut here, and I want to use it as a way to swing back around to Nina and ask her a little bit about process. Emma, if you show me the next slide, just a couple other works of Nina's here, but one on the right of a home under $50,000 that's in Gary, Indiana. And so Nina, I want to ask you about your work with the materiality of your process and your work with found lumber, which I understand plays a role here. And I saw you mention this Gary, Indiana piece in an interview, and or similar. So I threw it in kind of at the last minute. I hope you can tell us a little bit about how that works for you.
Well, yeah, that you can see it has sort of those little triangles are because it's a piece of old shelving that I found on the sidewalk. I want to first respond to Aric about like some background that I thought of. I mean, we can all go on about sustainable development and it's really very interesting, and it's a long conversation. So one of the ways I got into using houses in my art was my friends were living in a loft in downtown Brooklyn, and the building was slated to be demolished so that they could build Metrotech, which is a big commercial development. And this was decades ago. And in the back of this loft, it had been a real estate office. And in the back, I don't know if it was a real estate office, but in the back were file cabinets full of real estate listings from the 30s and the 20s and the 40s. And I took out these real estate listings, and they were these amazing listings. And I wanted to time travel because the houses were like $500, $1,000, but not that I wanted them, but I was just like, these amazing listings, but they would describe them, and you'd see these women in these old dresses and these old cars and these old real estate listings. So I'm trying to get back to where I'm going, which was, it was really strange that here I was in this loft that was slated to be demolished, and there were these real estate listings from the 1930s of these old houses. And it was just, it's all about, that process of, use and how that changes and how that grows and what we do with it and how we make that sustainable and how we make that work for us in all sorts of ways. And so this process, and what happened for me was I was doing a gut rehab of a place. And the way I got started doing woodcuts was I was throwing out all these scraps of lumber, and I was living in the place that I was doing a gut rehab. I was like camping out in it, and I lost myself. Okay, good. And I just started, well, what am I going to do with all this lumber scrap? And so I started carving it and printing it. And so I I love the goo and the muck of the nasty, messed up wood, and it really related a lot to these images of these houses. So many of them distressed, and so many of them with goo and muck, and I always loved what happened with these little triangles and I kept them there. And the process is, I never do what Aric does with 15 layers. I limit myself to 3 or 4 passes because I'm very impatient. And I couldn't possibly, I always start with 6 pieces of paper, which is why my editions are so small, because I always lose a couple along the way. And I just work fast, and I kind of think of myself as painting, because I don't even plan it. I just carve away what's going to be white, and I run it, and then I see, oh, what's next? And I carve away what's going to be the next one, and I run it. And I try not to plan or think about it, and I try to let it just grow out of the material and grow out of and the found stuff has so much life to it already, and I let that play into it, and I try to make it as organic as I can, because the indirectness of printmaking is sometimes it can sometimes get in the way of your creative process for me, you know.
I wanted to comment too, but Aric, it sounds like you wanted to say something.
Oh, they have such a wonderful immediateness to them. They really feel fresh. And sometimes you'll see a piece and the medium, and you just it's how paired they are. And this, you know, the comment you made about the wood on this dovetailed drawer, it looks like just suits perfectly.
Oh.
Yeah, and I was going to comment on the wonderful way that you negotiate, you know, precision and looseness in your drawing, but even moreover, the way that you handle the inking. So it strikes me that you're really making a lot of choices in the moment about more here, less there, and these are ways that you begin to be able to, it seems to me, approximate the kind of you know, textural fine grain of visual experience when you're looking at something. So, you know, if we look at that print on the left in the bottom right hand corner, what happens in the grass is just amazing and wonderful, and it's because of that particular way that you're inking the block. At least I'm assuming that's what's going on. So I'm really struck by that.
Oh, thanks. So yeah, I kind of I'm very monotypey in my inking, and there can't, even though you'd be surprised at how consistent the edition is, there's always you know, a bit of variation.
And Nick, you are primarily not making editions, is that right?
Most of, yeah, I mean, that's again, just the process is, yeah, I mean, I related to Nina's comment about being impatient. I share some of that for sure. And then I, you know, unlike some of my official and unofficial mentors, can't seem to conquer all of the possible registration problems that are available out there in the world. And so a better way to get at it is just to go ahead and try to make a monotype or monoprint that allows me to work in layer after layer after layer after layer, making subtle adjustments this way or that way, without simultaneously contending with the problem of doing that 15 times in a row perfectly. So that is a lot of why I was doing things that way. I'd started making screen prints more recently with the idea that I could maybe mimic some of the transparency effects that I can get out of the lithography inks that I use for the monotypes, and thereby be able to make some small additions. But I'm not really personally interested in printmaking as a multiple. I'm very invested and sort of in awe of that aspect of printmaking's tradition and history, I guess. But it's not useful to me. I sort of imagine myself mostly to be painting. and not because it's painting and not printmaking, but rather because I'm just trying to make one good one. That's my real investment.
And to use the tools of printmaking in order to achieve a certain process and effect along the way.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And that was, again, what was so awesome about working with Mirabeau, was to be able to return to intaglio and work with experts to try to get at what I knew was possible with what that medium can do.
Sure.
You know?
Emma, if you take us to the next slide, I just want to ask one final, I'm sorry, maybe just a couple ahead, because we have so many questions. I want to make sure we get some good audience questions in. I just want to show these. So on the left, we see some of Nina's dream homes, some of her linocut dream homes installed, kind of cut out and installed, I'm assuming maybe like wheat pasted or similar, onto the sort of built environment of a street. And then over on the right, we see Nick's work that sort of comes off the page and becomes a sort of installation or sculptural painting on the wall. I'm not sure what to call these, Nick. I'd be interested to hear from you. And I pair these side by side because I'm sort of interested in what happens when you take, I'm always interested in what happens when you take the print sort of off the page and put it into real space somehow. And so Nick, maybe I'd start with you and just ask if you can tell us this, hearkening back these shapes to what we looked at earlier, your images of signs and the way that they're kind of flipped around. So we're seeing the back here and we're literally seeing the armature of the sign. Tell us a little bit about this. Is this and I know you talked earlier about working kind of across modalities, kind of moving between spaces a lot, and that's evidenced. And if you take a look at Nick's greater practice, tell us a little bit about this work and how you think about this existing sculpturally.
Yeah, well, I was interested in, well, I suppose one way of thinking about it is that sometimes I'm motivated by a sense of dissatisfaction, right? So I'm doing something a certain way and I feel like, that's just not getting there, And I was feeling a little bit, I don't know, weird about being a picture maker, which is sort of how I think of myself. And so I was trying to think about, well, how can I sort of deal with these same ideas that I'm interested in and not be such a picture maker? And one way of doing that, I imagined anyway, was to put the work in a more direct relationship with the space in which you experience it, rather than putting it on a piece of paper and putting a piece of paper in a frame and then hanging the framed piece of paper, on the wall. What happens when you just sort of try to get a direct relationship between the work and the architecture? And that, I'd seen lots of people doing really cool and interesting things with pasted paper installation. And I learned a little bit about that from some experienced folks, and just started relief printing Luan sheets in various colors onto Kozo paper, mulberry paper, which I then would cut out into shapes and rice paste directly onto the wall. So you can't necessarily really see it here, but what this is the sign shapes themselves are those pieces of Kozo paper rice pasted directly onto the wall. And then I'm using magnets and actual real physical nuts, like nuts and bolts, to then affix relief printed sign posts on top of that. So actually, when you experience this, when you're able to be close to the work, you begin to see the dimensionality of it and see it moving away from the wall. To me, this is very much a work in progress, something I'm super interested in, but I'm not sure. I don't know quite yet what it needs to be or needs to become, or whether that's it, or how to reconcile my interest with color and with this new sculptural thing. And so lots of questions, and more questions than answers right so far at the moment.
Absolutely. I think they're really beautiful. And I would love to see these in person to see how that dimensionality works. And I think what it makes me think about always with installation is how immediate it is for the body and how it directly appeals to the viewer's body. Really underscores for me, and what I was thinking about when I was driving and seeing all these signs from the front and the back was how little bodies they are. They're just, they're sort of these stick figures on the side of the road. And it really made me think about them as in a way that I think all your work really estranges these daily visual experiences in a really nice and productive way. And so I think we have so many questions. I think I actually have to take some before we run out of time. We've got about 15 minutes left here. So let me just pull a couple of these up. I would say to all the artists if you're looking at the Q&A, there's also an answer live function. So if there are any questions that you feel compelled to just go ahead and type a little bit of an answer to, I would welcome you to do that. I'm going to raise a couple of these questions here. One is that there's a certain sense of nostalgia, particularly in Nina and Aric's work. I wonder whether all three artists could discuss the point where an image can tip towards sentimentality and how each deals with that. A great question and a tough one.
Yeah, that is a tough one. Gosh, Aric, do you have any ideas?
Sure. Yeah. No, that's a real thing. You know, I living amongst these buildings and seeing them go through changes, and you know, I love photography. I love film photography. I've taught it for years, and I'd go out with my camera and take photographs of banks of windows. And you know, I went back one week, and they were all been replaced. And you know, some of that magic on the backside of that building was just lost. And you know, I've got this stack of source material right now that keeps getting bigger, and the print stacks aren't getting bigger at the same rate. But like to try to get through some of that before you know all of this stuff has been you know kind of transformed. And is there some nostalgia in there? Sure. You know, does it, some of it feel a little personal, but you know, there can be a point where maybe it changes the path a little bit. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
I try not to be nostalgic or sentimental, and I try to make the pieces just portraits, and I guess sometimes I fail at that, and I end up if something veers too much towards nostalgia or sentimentality, which are things that I don't really like, and maybe people find my work to be that way. I guess I often throw things out that I feel have that feeling, and you know, I don't think of them as old buildings, like people think that I'm doing like you know dilapidated or old buildings. I just think of them as real estate, and I really do think of them as real estate. And real estate comes in all shapes and sizes and is repurposed in all shapes and ways. And I guess, you know, the feeling of the buildings and the houses. I mean, houses are nostalgic, and people always remember you know, their aunt's house or their grandparents' house or their, you know, and so it's hard to stay away from that, but it's not really where I'm trying to go. I don't know. That an answer?
You know,
I mean,
go ahead, Nick.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think of it, you know, it's almost sort of obvious to say, or too obvious to say, that maybe all three of us are interested in noticing things, and then maybe not exactly documenting them in an uninflected way, but noticing them and trying to, through our own process, put something of how we feel about that into them, which I don't know, you know, I respond to what Nina's saying about it not being about nostalgia, but about, I don't know, wanting to make something visible, I guess, right? Is that, you know, here's this subject, and it's interesting, and it warrants being present and being presented. And so that's certainly how I think about my stuff, which I sort of think of as significantly to the surrealist end of the spectrum relative to Aric and Nina, but that's how I would approach that question.
I'm also always think of myself as a sort of a colorist too from the get-go, you know? And so I relate to what you were saying, Nick, about color, but I also really relate to Aric's all those different panes with it slightly. That's what I was trying to look at, like how you got all those different panes doing all those different things and how you got so much depth, when I find that often people, when they layer on their reduction prints, they lose their depth, but you managed to get that. And I'm really curious about how you kept that luminosity and that depth. And that's what I was trying to like see. That's why I put my glasses on. And I can't wait to see I would love to see those other ones, the ones with all the panes in person, but I guess they're not in the show, but I'll have to figure out a studio visit at some point. And I'm really curious about what inks you're using, which is what I was doing. But so I love the, you know, the play and the push and the pull and the emotion of color. And so I also, you know, there's the abstract play of color with me always going too. So
there's so much to enjoy in the formal elements and in those windows that it's, you know, there can be the, you know, the personal, what you experienced standing in front of it is important to convey. But, you know, once I started looking closely, it just shifts into, oh, you know, exactly. It's a study in blue. It's, you know, it's a breakdown of fragmented geometry. There's so much to look at. And so, yeah, I mean, I think certainly I can agree with that part.
Thank you. I think we only have time for like one more, although I'll ask like maybe a couple of very fast lightning round questions just to get a few off the answer very quickly. Nina, did you grow up in a house or an apartment?
I grew up in an apartment.
An apartment. Answered. Let's see. Nina, are you familiar with the houses built with Sears and Roebuck craftsman kits?
Yes, a friend of mine had one. It was pretty sweet.
Aric, can you talk about the modern skyscraper? This might be a little bit too big of a question for a lightning round, but the work that's in the show is so much more photograph-like than what we've looked at a little bit more tonight. Are you trying to make them less or more like flat, bland? Is there something a statement you're trying to make about that type of building through that formal choice?
Is the factories are trying to be flatter? Is that the question?
Like skyscraper type.
Yeah, the skyscraper, you know, that was partially influenced by a trip to the city where I noticed the skyline had changed so dramatically since I was there last. And that feeling of looking up and wondering who's up there, who lives up there. You know, I think the feel is very much more a state of isolation. You know, both maybe from the viewer and also from maybe the interior, from someone inside. So I don't know, you know, if I wasn't necessarily trying to make that image more photographic. I think maybe, you know, it was for me more effective that way. But, you know, within the process, the tight crop on that also comes across a little crisper. There's no horizon line. You don't see the top or the bottom of the building. And so there's a sense of ambiguity about where you are. And maybe, you know, it demanded some detail and clarity in that matter.
And for a great anonymous, I actually have this question too. So I'm so glad someone read my mind. For me, Nick's work borders on 1950s science fiction looking toward the 21st century. For Nick, did this ever enter into your thought process while conceiving the images?
It didn't really directly, no. And I haven't really read a lot of science fiction for no good reason. Maybe I should, but I relate to the comment very much. And I'm struck by the way science fiction, at least as I understand it, by virtue of this, tremendous imaginative process that goes into that genre, often in an unsettling way anticipates some of the things that happen that we do in spite of our, well, I don't know, in spite of what, in spite of what maybe we ought to do, that the unintended consequences of the march into the future. So I relate to that.
Fantastic. And then for just a quick yes or no, I think from all of you, because you're all also painters, I understand. Do you paint and print at the same time? Not literally at the same time, but are you working on painting at the same time that you're working on print? Do these inform each other? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. In different ways though. And I'm so excited about the print process right now because it's new and it's fresh. And so in some ways, painting's taken a back seat, but it's, for things that are more immediate, I love, small still life and things around the studio. That would be my go-to.
And absolutely yes for me as well, but I'm actually in a reversed situation to Aric right now. Having been primarily a painter for some good measure of time, and then now 10 years of being primarily a printmaker, I'm excited to crack open some new painting ideas that I have.
Fantastic. I just want to make, this is not a question, but just a comment that is in the Q&A box that I think is a really nice place to close, which is a note here from Chaim Gross, who says, gentrification, redlining, and the transition of work in America from physical to mental / virtual / managerial is driving the transformation of our built environment as shown so deeply and clearly in all this work. And I think that's just a really nice point I wanted to share there as we conclude. This was so interesting to hear from all of you. Thank you so much. We've gone like right up to the end here. So I want to just thank Nina and Aric and Nick for being here tonight, for having such an interesting conversation, and to our audience for asking such great questions. And I want to thank Emma, who's behind the scenes running the tech with me tonight and doing our screen sharing, and Caption Access, who's captioning the talk tonight. Thank you everybody for joining us. Emma, if you can just show our closing slides. So we are hosting one more artist conversation in conjunction with Lonely Hearts. That's scheduled for the evening of August 10th, and the registration for that is going to be open soon. It's going to be a similar format to tonight. So if you liked that, come see us in August. We'll have another great discussion. You can get the most up-to-date info from IPCNY at IPCNY on Instagram, or you can join our newsletter and you'll get the registration right away when it opens. And so thank you, everybody. If you can fill out that survey I mentioned, it's going to open automatically in a browser right when we close the Zoom webinar. And everyone be safe, have a great night, and come see the show at IPCNY. It's open until September 18th. You can find all the more information at ipcny.org. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, thanks.
Thanks.